Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of the Gospel of Matthew with chapter 27, part 1 of 2 parts. Here's the outline of our study. Jesus Christ, the King of the house of David. We're in part 4, Enduring the Cross. We started this in chapter 26 and we'll conclude this section at the end of chapter 27. When we look at the chronology of Christ's last week on earth, before his resurrection, we find out that we have made it to Friday of that week. Notice that there will be no activity recorded on Saturday, and then Sunday, chapter 28 will carry us through. In our section, Enduring the Cross, we've already looked at plots of foes and devotions of friends, the Last Supper and the agony in the garden, and the betrayal. And now we will finish this section by looking at the Jewish and Roman trials, which we began at the end of chapter 26, and then the crucifixion and burial. We've divided chapter 27 into these topics. And we will look at the man who sentenced Jesus to death, Pilate's losing struggle, the traitor's end, and the soldier's mockery in the first 31 verses of chapter 27 in this video, and then we'll finish the chapter in the following video. Let's get our Bibles out, and you'll note that we're reading in a rather awkward way today, jumping around. So we'll read 1 and 2 and then 11 through 26. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death, and they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate the governor. Verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even a single charge. So the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Sanhedrin needed to formulate a charge against Jesus that Pilate would accept as a capital offense, because it was against Roman law for them to carry out the death penalty themselves. And they knew that Pilate would not hear a charge of blasphemy, but Matthew does not tell us what charges they brought before Pilate. Luke does tell us in Luke 23:2. they concocted 3 charges of a political nature. He is a revolutionary, they said. He incited the people to not pay their taxes, and he claimed to be king. You can pause the video here and go look at Luke 23:2 and also John 18:36. What kind of man was Pilate? Well, we know he was at least 27 years of age, and he answered directly to the Emperor of Rome. To be appointed governor, he had to have had military experience, and he had to have been a tested administrator. We know from secular history he was governor of Judea for about 10 years, beginning in AD 27. When Pilate arrived in Jerusalem, he was ready to deal harshly with the Jews. Previous governors have been careful not to offend the Jews with graven eagles on their standards, but Pilate entered the city for the first time being led by just those standards. Later on, he relented and removed the eagles from the standards. When he later decided to build a new water system for the city, he took money from the temple treasury to do it. And because he was utterly corrupt, the Jews were well within their rights to report him to Rome. He came to fear them because of this right. Secular scholars report that he was insolent, insulting, murderous, cruel, and capable of gratuitous inhumanity. Eventually, his cruelty became his downfall, and after complaints concerning an incident in Samaria, he was recalled to Rome. And here we lose track of Pilate, and only certain legends remain. The Coptic Church teaches that Pilate eventually converted to Christianity as well as his wife, and they are listed as saints by the Coptics. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, and all the ceremonial hand-washing in the world would not absolve him of the part he played in the crucifixion of Christ. It was most likely because of his past misdeeds that the Jews had a lever with which to manipulate him in this manner. So Pilate's struggle was a losing one. We can see Pilate was clearly impressed with Jesus. He felt the power of Jesus, but he was afraid to submit to it. So Pilate sought some way to escape. To give the people a choice as to who to release from prison for the festival was probably how he planned to let Jesus go. Barabbas was a true criminal and a revolutionary who was convicted and in jail for very good reasons. The crowd preferred the man of violence to the man of love. When this occurred, Pilate attempted to unshoulder the responsibility for Christ's condemnation. Oddly enough, this hand-washing that he performed was a Jewish, not a Roman custom. You can go look in Deuteronomy 21, verses 1 through 9 for that. Pilate was warned by his sense of justice. He was warned by his own conscience, and he was warned by the dream of his wife, but he still chose to acquiesce to the crowd. So what was his hand-washing worth? It was worth nothing. In our own language, we sometimes say, I wash my hands of all responsibility. Well, if we're responsible, then nothing we say or do will ever absolve us of that responsibility. To Christians, Pilate is more to be pitied than vilified. How did a crowd that afforded Jesus the welcome, what we call the triumphal entry of chapter 21, verses 8 through 11, turn on him so quickly? Remember, it's been not even a week since the triumphal entry, and now the crowd is yelling and screaming for this man to be crucified. Well, I want to share something with you from Elton Trueblood from his book Confronting Christ, as quoted by Kenneth Chumbley in his commentary on Matthew. The cruelty of men is potentially so great that it can hardly be exaggerated. There are few scenes in which mankind demonstrates its unloveliness more than in a mob. The members of the mob are wonderfully safe, for the victim is wholly at their mercy. They know that they're invulnerable because the lone person is not in a position to defend himself. This is why mob action is essentially cowardly. It is cowardly because the many who bait the one run no personal risk. Mob action is, accordingly, among the most despicable of human actions. Now let's get our Bibles back out and read the part we skipped concerning the end of Judas Iscariot. Verse 3. Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the piece of silver into the temple, he departed and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it's blood money. So they took counsel and bought with these pieces of silver the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Judas comes to realize his mistake. He comes to realize his sin. He throws the money into the temple, and he goes out and he hangs himself. The only gospel writer to include Judas's suicide, it is apparently inserted here to contrast Jesus and Judas, namely courage versus cowardice, as well as contrasting Peter and Judas, repentance versus despair. Judas teaches us two great truths about sin. Number one, the terrible thing about sin is we cannot put the clock back. This truth should make us doubly careful how we act. And secondly, the strange thing about sin is a man can come to hate the very thing he thought he gained by it. Many times the sinful things we desire are easier to obtain than they are to get rid of. It's interesting that Matthew quotes from Jeremiah a passage that we find in Zechariah 11:10 through 14. I want to share something I found in Chumbley's commentary about this difficulty. Numerous resolutions for this apparent discrepancy have been proposed. For example, Jeremiah is a scribal error. Jeremiah was the first book of the prophetic section of the Hebrew Bible and served as a generic heading for all the prophets. Though Jeremiah was sometimes placed first, Isaiah usually occupies that position. The Jeremiah passage to which Matthew refers to has been lost, is another idea. It was an oral prophecy handed down from Jeremiah. These are all ideas as to why Matthew gave Jeremiah credit for this quote. A more plausible answer is that this is the fulfillment of a nonverbal prophecy. This is what Bales suggests in his book, Prophecy and Premillennialism, page 140 and 142. Two passages in Jeremiah especially suggest this. In 32:6 through 9, the prophet buys a field for 17 shekels of silver, and then in 19:1 through 13, he buys a potter's jar, takes some elders and priests to the valley of Hinnom, pronounces judgment on Jerusalem for, among other things, shedding innocent blood, verse 4. Then he smashes the jar to depict the city's fate in verse 10. Other thematic links in this text include renaming a locality associated with potters, chapter 19, verse 1, with the name Valley of Slaughter, denoting violence, chapter 19, verse 6. The place will henceforth be used as a burial ground, chapter 19, verse 11, as as a token of God's judgment, as suggested by D.A. Carson in his commentary, page 563. To complete the prophecy, the Zechariah reference to the 30 pieces of silver is added, with the whole reference attributed to Jeremiah. You can see also Mark 1, verses 2 and 3, where Malachi 3:1 is fused to Isaiah 43, but Isaiah is cited as the source of both quotes in the American Standard Version. I don't know if going over things like this is helpful or not, but at least it gives us an idea of the possibility of why we find this idea of 30 pieces of silver from Zechariah given credit not to Zechariah but to Jeremiah. Now let's get back to the study. It is ironic that amid committing the greatest crime ever committed, the Jewish leaders were concerned with putting blood money back in the treasury. The use of blood money to buy the potter's field was not simply a coincidental agreement with prophecy, but it's exactly what God had foretold. And you can see Acts 2:23 on that. A faithful Judas would have most likely died a martyr's death. Instead, he hurried things along and then found his life intolerable and denied himself the glory of the martyr's crown that probably 11 or 10 of the other 11 apostles suffered. Most agree that they all died a martyr's death, save John, who appeared to die of old age. Well, that brings us to the next major section of chapter 27, which is the crucifixion and the burial. We're going to talk about the soldiers' mockery here in this video and then save the rest of the topics for the following video. Let's read verses 27 through 31. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him, and took the reed, and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, put his own clothes on him, and led him away and crucified him. We'll say a word or two about the scourging. Many men did not survive the scourging, and some lost their ability to reason as it went along. Most did not maintain consciousness through it. We know that Pilate's personal bodyguard consisted of up to 600 men, but it's doubtful that all 600 had gathered for this scourging. The cruel horseplay was typical of the pre-crucifixion preparations, but unlike Pilate and the Jews, these foreign soldiers were acting in pure ignorance. In their eyes, he was nothing but a deluded Galilean going to the cross. What do the historians say about crucifixion? Well, we'll read some things from Barclay's commentary concerning this. The first thing I want to share is Barclay talks about what Klausner, the Jewish writer, says. We'll get to that in a second. Then they prepared to lead him away to crucifixion. We are sometimes told that we should not dwell on the physical aspect of the cross, but we cannot possibly have too vivid a picture of what Jesus did and suffered for us. And here's what Klausner had to say about crucifixion. Crucifixion is the most terrible and cruel death which man has ever devised for taking vengeance on his fellow men. Cicero called it the most cruel and the most horrible torture, and Tacitus called it a torture only fit for slaves. The Romans reserved it for foreigners only. No Roman citizen was allowed to be crucified. Let me continue reading from Barclay more of what Klausner has to say. Klausner goes on to describe crucifixion. The criminal was fastened to his cross, already a bleeding mass from the scourging, and there he hung to die of hunger and thirst and exposure, unable even to defend himself from the torture of the gnats and the flies which settled on his naked body and on his bleeding wounds. It is not a pretty picture, but that is what Jesus Christ suffered willingly for us. That's all we have time for this video. Thank you for watching. Please join us next time when we conclude our study of Matthew 27. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do. Also, click the notification bell, give this video a like, and leave us a comment. We would enjoy hearing from all of you. Till the next time we meet, may God bless.